The northern plains were a wasteland of white. Snow stretched in unbroken sheets across the landscape, a biting wind whipping across ridges and valleys, cutting through even the heaviest furs. The world was silent except for the howl of the storm, a mournful, bone-chilling sound that seemed to mock any who dared travel through it. In this unforgiving winter, life was fragile, and death came as silently as the falling snowflakes. Dakota, a giant of an Apache warrior, moved through the storm with the ease of a predator in his element. Towering over most men, his broad shoulders and thick muscles were covered by layers of furs and animal hides. Yet his movements were deliberate and precise, each step a careful negotiation with the treacherous snowdrifts. He had lived all his life in the harsh northern plains, learning to read the whispers of the wind, the faintest tracks in the snow, and the subtle signs of danger that others overlooked. His face was a map of experience, high cheekbones, sharp eyes that could pierce through the whiteout, and a jaw set in quiet determination. Despite his size and fearsome appearance, there was an intelligence and calm in his gaze, a deep understanding of the delicate balance between life and death. Dakota's hunt had begun early in the morning. He had been tracking a herd of elk, moving silently across frozen streams and snow-covered plains. The air was crisp and sharp, filling his lungs with the sting of winter, yet he welcomed it. It kept him alert. As he navigated a narrow ridge, he noticed something unusual. The snow beneath his feet was disturbed, trampled in an unnatural pattern. There were broken twigs, splintered wood, and tracks that didn't belong to animals. A flicker of instinct, years of survival training, alerted him to the presence of humans. But something was wrong. The tracks led toward a burned-out wagon, half buried in the snow, its wood blackened and twisted from fire. Dakota approached cautiously, every sense alert. The wind howled around him, threatening to knock him off balance, but he moved like a shadow across the ice. As he neared the wagon, he noticed a faint, uneven rise in the snow beneath its wreckage. There was movement, subtle, barely perceptible, but enough for a trained eye. Kneeling carefully, he brushed the snow away with gloved hands and revealed the source, a young woman, barely conscious, wedged beneath the remains of the cart. Her arm was bent at an unnatural angle, bruised and bleeding, and her face was pale, lips blue from cold. Snowflakes clung to her hair and clothing, and her shallow breaths left small clouds of frost in the frigid air. Dakota's heart, though tempered by years of hardship, stirred with a protective instinct. He had seen death claim many in these lands, travelers lost in blizzards, hunted by men and beasts alike. But he had never found a human so close to being swallowed by the winter itself. He acted quickly, assessing her injuries with practiced efficiency. Her broken arm was severe, but not immediately life-threatening. Her bruises and the cold were her greatest danger. Exposure could kill her faster than the outlaws who had ambushed her. The story of the massacre became clear in fragments. The wagon, once part of a small caravan, had been ambushed by outlaws seeking gold and supplies. Dakota found evidence of struggle, deep gouges in the snow where weapons had struck, smoldering remnants of fire, and the faint traces of blood that had long since frozen. Only she had survived, hidden beneath the overturned wagon, her presence a miracle against the odds. Dakota, moving with both urgency and care, lifted her onto his back, using broken wagon planks to create a makeshift stretcher that would allow him to navigate the deep snow more safely. Each step was a battle. The snow was deep, and every movement required both strength and balance. The wind lashed at them, and the cold threatened to steal her life even as he carried her. As they traveled, Dakota's mind briefly considered the possibility of pursuing the outlaws. But survival came first. The storm was relentless, and the plains were unforgiving. Predators, wolves, cougars, and the ever-present threat of frostbite lurked in every shadow. He pushed forward, moving with careful efficiency, glancing back only occasionally to check her shallow breaths. Despite his size and endurance, even he struggled under the weight of the snow, the wind, and the burden of keeping another alive. His every thought was focused on reaching shelter, on preserving the fragile warmth of life in a world that offered none. Even as they moved, Isabella, the young woman, murmured incoherently. Her words were broken by pain and cold, but fragments reached Dakota's ears. She spoke of her father, of lands far to the south, of a home she feared she would never see again. Though he did not understand the full meaning of her words, he sensed importance, a dignity and status that made her more than just another victim of the wilderness. He filed the details away, though survival remained the priority. Her hidden nobility would only reveal itself with time, like a secret beneath the snow waiting to emerge. The tension of the journey built with every step. Dakota was not invincible. Each footfall risked slipping across ice or plunging into hidden crevasses. Each gust of wind threatened to knock him and the fragile human on his back into the cold embrace of the plains. He was aware of every sound, the cracking of distant branches under weight, the faint howl of wolves in the distance, and the ever-present whisper of the storm. Yet, despite the peril, there was a rhythm to his movement, a connection between man, environment, and survivor that spoke of mastery over the wild. The outline of their journey concluded with a moment of near catastrophe. A pack of wolves, drawn by scent and movement, appeared on the ridge ahead. Their eyes glinted in the dim light, teeth bared, a clear and immediate threat. Dakota's muscles tensed, his mind calculating the safest route, the best way to protect the fragile life upon his back. He moved with quiet authority, preparing to confront nature and danger in a battle where strength, wit, and courage would determine whether they lived to see the next sunrise. By the end of this first chapter of survival, the story establishes the brutal environment, the desperate peril, and the extraordinary capabilities of Dakota. It sets the tone for a narrative of resilience, courage, and the hidden connections that fate weaves between strangers. Isabella's survival is uncertain, the storm relentless, and the true story of her identity only hinted at in whispered words, waiting for the right moment to unfold. The snowstorm showed no mercy. Days had passed since Dakota first lifted Isabella from the wrecked wagon, and the endless plains stretched before them like an unbroken sea of white. The wind carried shards of ice that cut through fur and clothing, leaving raw, stinging marks across exposed skin. Visibility was minimal, and even the strongest of lungs struggled against the frigid air. Yet Dakota pressed forward, moving with a rhythm honed by years of survival. Every step was deliberate, a negotiation between fatigue and determination, between the immediate dangers of nature and the fragile human life upon his back. Isabella's condition had worsened over the first night. Exposure had drained her strength, and the fever from her injuries began to take hold. Her breaths were shallow, and she shivered violently beneath the furs Dakota had wrapped around her. Each time she murmured faintly, he leaned close to catch the fragments of her speech. Her words were fragmented and often incoherent, but hints of her upbringing, her education, and her family's status flickered through her murmurs. Dakota did not question them. The immediate concern was keeping her alive, warming her body, stabilizing her arm, and ensuring that neither frostbite nor infection claimed her before shelter could be reached. The first night after the rescue had been brutal. Dakota had dug a shallow trench in the snow, using broken wagon planks as a base and layered furs over Isabella. He had created a small fire from scavenged wood, using the skills of his ancestors to shield the flame from the howling wind. Smoke curled upward, blending with the swirling snow, a fragile signal against the oppressive white. He had remained awake, vigilantly scanning the horizon, listening for any threat. Wolves, scavengers, or even rival humans could appear without warning. His senses were stretched to their limits, yet he remained patient and steady, a silent guardian against the merciless cold. By morning, Isabella's eyes fluttered open, revealing a mix of fear, confusion, and gratitude. She tried to sit, but the pain in her arm and the chill in her body forced her back down. Dakota's calm voice broke through the storm, instructing her to rest. He offered her water from a small flask he carried, though it was ice cold, and some of the hard bread he had salvaged from the wagon. She ate hesitantly, her lips trembling from both cold and weakness. In that moment, the distance between them began to shrink. Survival had created a bond stronger than words, a connection forged in the crucible of life and death. As they continued, Dakota taught her simple survival techniques, moving beyond the purely practical to the almost spiritual. He showed her how to sense changes in the wind that indicated danger, how to recognize subtle signs of animals nearby, and how to move through deep snow without exhausting precious energy. Isabella listened intently, absorbing each lesson, though her body protested every movement. At first, it was out of necessity, but slowly, she began to admire Dakota's discipline, his strength, and the way he treated her with respect rather than pity. The journey was not without peril. At one point, they encountered a frozen river, its surface glinting deceptively in the pale winter sun. Dakota assessed the ice carefully, testing each section with a long branch. One wrong step could plunge them into the freezing water below, and hypothermia would surely follow. He led Isabella across with painstaking caution, taking the lead and signaling her when to move. Her hand clutched his arm tightly, an unconscious gesture that spoke of both trust and growing reliance. In the midst of danger, their bond deepened, no longer just survivor and rescuer, but companions united against the elements. Pause. Conversation between them remained sparse at first, broken by exhaustion and pain. Isabella murmured pieces of her life, fragments of a world she had lost, a grand house, fine clothing, and servants who had tended to her every need. Dakota listened, but never asked for details, knowing the priority was survival. Yet, the glimpses he caught, her refined manners, her awareness of lands and people far from this wilderness, stirred a curiosity within him. She was more than she appeared, a hidden nobility in the body of someone who seemed helpless. He kept his observations private, focusing on the present danger, yet a subtle tension of unspoken questions began to develop between them. The harshness of the storm forced moments of vulnerability. One evening, as Dakota built another fire To ward off the biting cold, Isabella shivered uncontrollably. He removed his outer furs and wrapped them around her, pressing her close to share body heat. Their proximity was awkward, but necessary, and the warmth offered more than mere protection from frostbite. It was the beginning of trust, of intimacy born from survival. Isabella, in her weakened state, relied on his strength not only to protect her life, but to provide comfort, a human connection that reminded her she was not alone. During this journey, small but meaningful interactions occurred. Dakota would point out animal tracks, explaining how each told a story. "See these prints?" he would say. "The deer went this way. It ran from a predator, maybe a wolf. Nature does not wait for anyone." Isabella began to mirror his observations, learning to see the landscape not as a barren wasteland, but as a network of life and survival. She marveled at his knowledge, his ability to read the world like a living book, and her respect for him deepened. Yet the threat of danger remained ever present. Wolves still followed from a distance, their eyes glinting through the snow, silent observers of the human drama. Dakota would sometimes pause, placing himself between Isabella and potential predators. His instincts sharper than any weapon. The tension was constant, an unspoken understanding that their survival depended on vigilance, skill, and unyielding determination. Slowly, Isabella began to share more of herself, speaking of her family with reverence, revealing snippets of wealth and responsibility that she could barely articulate. She spoke of lands with towering houses, of servants who called her Miss Isabella, and of a life that seemed almost mythic against the harsh backdrop of the northern plains. Dakota listened quietly, absorbing every detail, but his focus remained on keeping her alive. Her status intrigued him, but it was secondary to the immediate reality of snow, cold, and the dangers that lurked unseen. By the end of this stage of their journey, they had crossed valleys, frozen rivers, and snow-laden forests. Each challenge reinforced their bond. Isabella had begun to see Dakota not just as a giant warrior, but as a protector, a teacher, and someone whose quiet strength offered stability in an otherwise chaotic world. Dakota, in turn, had glimpsed the depth beneath her fragile exterior, the courage, intelligence, and nobility that had not been erased by tragedy. The outline closes with a scene at dusk, as the wind dies down slightly and the sun sets behind the frozen peaks. They are exhausted, but still alive, a small fire between them offering warmth and a moment of respite. Isabella, her body still weak, rests her head on Dakota's shoulder, trusting him fully. He watches the horizon, eyes scanning for threats, but also reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. A silent understanding passes between them. Survival is temporary, but connection, even in the harshest winter, is eternal. The snow had begun to thin, leaving behind jagged rocks and the skeletal remains of winter-battered trees. Dakota and Isabella had traveled for days through an unrelenting wilderness, each moment a test of endurance, each step a confrontation with the dangers of the plains. Yet even as the harsh environment continued to press upon them, a shift had begun. Isabella's strength was returning slowly, fueled by Dakota's care and the protective warmth of their makeshift fires. Her once fragile body now showed signs of resilience, and her mind, sharpened by fear and hardship, began to reclaim clarity. One evening, as the twilight bled across the horizon in pale hues of gold and violet, Isabella whispered something she had been holding back. "Dakota, you should know who I really am," she said, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. She paused, shivering slightly in the cold, and met his eyes with a mix of apprehension and determination. Dakota, who had grown accustomed to her quiet murmurs and fragmented confessions, nodded. "I will listen," he said simply, his deep voice steady, carrying the assurance that she would be heard without judgment. Isabella revealed her true identity in hushed, almost reverent tones. She was not merely a traveler or the daughter of a distant family. She was of nobility, hidden even from the eyes of those who might wish her harm. Her father had been a respected lord in the Southern Territories, a man whose wealth and influence extended over vast lands. She had been traveling to visit relatives when the wagon massacre occurred, a journey meant to be routine, but turned into a nightmare. The revelation stunned Dakota, not because of the wealth or status it implied, but because it added a new layer of danger to their already perilous journey. Nobility, in these harsh lands, painted a target on one's back, attracting the greedy, the ruthless, and the violent. Dakota's response was not one of awe, but of pragmatism. He understood immediately that Isabella's life was more than endangered by the elements and wild animals. Human threats were now more pressing than ever. His loyalty, forged through the struggle for survival, would be tested in ways he could not yet predict. He promised silently to protect her, not because of the title she held, but because of the trust she had placed in him. His actions, always guided by honor and instinct, now carried the weight of her hidden identity. The next day, as they traversed a narrow pass between frozen cliffs, the first test of loyalty arrived. Outlaws, likely remnants of the band responsible for the wagon massacre, emerged from the sparse tree line. Their eyes gleamed with malice, hands gripping crude rifles and knives. As they recognized the opportunity to capture or kill, Isabella froze, fear etched across her face, but Dakota's presence was immediate and commanding. He stepped in front of her, body taut with readiness, his shadow stretching across the snow like an immovable wall. The confrontation was brutal. The outlaws underestimated Dakota, seeing only a man in furs, yet his size, skill, and sheer force were overwhelming. Each movement was precise, a punch here, a sweep there, disarming men with a fluidity that belied his immense power. The snow became a battlefield, footprints obscured by the wind, every strike punctuated by the hiss of cold air and the crunch of boots against ice. Dakota fought not for glory, but for survival, both his and Isabella's. Amid the chaos, Isabella found herself acting instinctively, using the lessons Dakota had taught her. She moved quietly, grabbed rocks to throw when men were distracted, and even assisted in tipping a small tree branch to block a narrow path. Her bravery surprised even herself. The bond they had formed in the snowstorm, the trust, the unspoken understanding, enabled them to operate as a seamless unit. Each action complemented the others, and together they forced the outlaws into retreat. Those who survived fled into the trees, leaving the pair alone once again in the quiet expanse of the plains. After the confrontation, Isabella's hidden nobility became a silent but potent factor in their journey. She began to speak more clearly of her family, her lands, and the influence her father wielded. Dakota listened, absorbing every word, yet never allowed her status to diminish her agency. He treated her with the same respect he had shown since their first encounter, recognizing her vulnerability without patronizing her, acknowledging her nobility without bowing to it. This delicate balance forged a deeper connection between them. They camped that night near a small, partially frozen stream. The water gurgled faintly beneath a thin layer of ice, a rare sign of life in the frozen wilderness. Dakota built a fire and prepared a small meal from dried meat and berries scavenged along the way. Isabella helped, her hands steadier than before, her confidence growing in the presence of someone who neither feared nor underestimated her. As they ate, the conversation turned to dreams, fears, and the improbable twist of fate that had brought them together. She spoke of her childhood, of formal lessons and dances, of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. Dakota shared stories of his tribe, of survival, honor, and the spirits that guided him. The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the contrasts, strength and delicacy, wilderness and nobility, survival and society, yet also illuminating the harmony forming between them. In the following days, Dakota faced subtle tests of loyalty and judgment. Isabella's status made them vulnerable to human threats. Wandering bandits, rival factions, and those seeking ransom. Each encounter required careful strategy, foresight, and courage. Dakota's decisions were informed not only by instinct, but by the emerging awareness that Isabella's life carried weight far beyond the immediate. Her survival meant the preservation of a lineage, a legacy intertwined with lands, influence, and power that could be weaponized against him if fallen into the wrong hands. Yet he never let fear cloud his care for her. His focus remained unwavering, to ensure she reached safety. The narrative emphasizes moments of quiet intimacy amidst danger. Dakota tended to Isabella's recovering injuries, using his knowledge of herbs and bandaging techniques. He soothed her with gentle words, not commands, his massive hands surprisingly tender as they worked to restore her strength. Isabella, in turn, began to trust not only his skill, but his judgment, recognizing that the giant warrior carried not only the strength to protect, but the wisdom to lead them through a world indifferent to their survival. By the end of this outline, their relationship had transformed. Isabella's hidden nobility was no longer a secret, but a living reality shaping their path. Dakota's loyalty had been tested and proven, solidifying a bond that transcended the harshness of the environment. They were no longer merely survivor and rescuer. They were partners in endurance, united by trust, courage, and an understanding that each depended upon the other in ways both profound and life-defining. The chapter closes with the two of them standing on a ridge, overlooking the frozen plains, the wind dying down, and the first hints of spring lightening the horizon. Dakota's eyes scan the distance for threats, yet they also linger on Isabella, recognizing the strength and nobility she carries within her. Isabella, for her part, sees Dakota not just as a protector, but as a force of nature, someone whose courage and honor had become a beacon in the blinding snow. The world remains harsh, and dangers persist, but together they are stronger than the trials ahead. The snow was receding, but the plains remained a treacherous expanse of ice, jagged rocks, and hidden crevasses. Dakota and Isabella had survived days of relentless winter, and yet the world remained indifferent to their struggle. Every step forward was a negotiation with the land, every shadow a potential threat. The events of the past days, the massacre, the wolves, the bandits, had bound them together in ways neither could have anticipated. A fragile sense of safety had emerged, But Dakota knew it was only temporary. Survival in this land demanded vigilance at all times. The morning was pale and still. The sun rose like a washed-out ghost behind a veil of thin clouds, casting a grayish light over the snow-streaked plains. Isabella had regained more strength, her fever subsiding, and her breathing steadier. Her arm, though still tender, was wrapped securely, and her movements were less hesitant. As she walked beside Dakota, she began to notice the nuances of his presence. How his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. How his massive frame moved with fluid grace over ice and snow. How every step seemed calculated yet effortless. There was a quiet intensity about him that drew her attention, a mixture of raw power and unwavering care that left an imprint on her heart. Their journey took a sudden turn when a band of mounted outlaws appeared on a distant ridge. The snow and wind had previously masked the sound of their approach, and now the gleam of rifles and knives caught the weak sunlight. Dakota froze instinctively, scanning the ridge. He could feel the tension in Isabella, subtle yet palpable. He did not speak. He didn't need to. His body language, the tilt of his head, the narrowing of his eyes, communicated a silent warning. Danger was near, and every moment counted. Dakota moved first. Using his knowledge of the terrain, he led Isabella to a narrow canyon, hidden by snow-laden pines and jagged rocks. Their approach was deliberate. Each step required careful placement to avoid slipping on ice or alerting the outlaws. Isabella followed closely, trusting him without hesitation. There was no time for questions, only action. Survival demanded unity, a seamless coordination that had been forged over days of shared struggle. The confrontation was inevitable. Outlaws tracked them, their shouts echoing across the canyon. Dakota positioned himself between Isabella and the threat, his shadow casting a protective barrier. As the men advanced, he used a combination of brute strength and calculated strategy to neutralize them. Snow became both camouflage and weapon. Rocks were dislodged to create obstacles. Frozen branches whipped across the faces of advancing men. Every move was precise. Every strike intentional. Isabella, though hesitant at first, began to act. She hurled small stones with unerring aim, disrupted the attacker's balance, and even ducked behind Dakota to provide tactical advantage. Their teamwork was instinctive now, born of necessity and refined through shared danger. The fight, though brief, left a lingering tension in the canyon. The outlaws retreated, but Dakota knew they would return. Survival was never guaranteed in this land, and the fragile sense of safety was only temporary. Isabella, her heart still racing, looked up at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. In the firelight from their previous nights, she had felt admiration. Now, in the aftermath of danger, a new, deeper emotion took root. She saw not just a protector, but a man whose courage, honor, and unwavering presence had become essential to her very survival. As they moved on, the snow began to melt, revealing small patches of earth and the dark roots of trees. The plains were still harsh, but the change of season brought a different kind of challenge. Rivers swollen with melting ice, slippery slopes, and hidden pools of water that could drown the unwary. Dakota's vigilance never wavered. He taught Isabella how to navigate these new hazards, how to test the strength of the ground, and how to move quietly, yet quickly. She absorbed his teachings eagerly, each lesson reinforcing her admiration and trust. It was during one such crossing, a narrow, ice-covered stream, that their emotional bond deepened in a way neither expected. Isabella slipped, nearly plunging into the freezing water. Dakota's reflexes were instantaneous. He grabbed her arm, pulling her against his chest, holding her with a strength that both protected and enveloped her. For a moment, the storm outside the canyon seemed distant. Her eyes met his, wide with shock and gratitude. And in that brief contact, the unspoken tension between them became undeniable. Her heartbeat was rapid, and she could feel his steady pulse beneath her hands. Words were unnecessary. The emotions between them were clear. Trust had grown into something more, something tender yet fierce, shaped by shared danger and mutual reliance. The night that followed was quiet, but heavy with unspoken feelings. Dakota built a fire, careful to shield it from the wind, and offered Isabella warmth and food. She sat close, wrapped in furs, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. There was a silence between them, comfortable and intimate, filled with understanding that had been forged through hardship. She felt the solidity of him, the safety of his presence, and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that promised protection. He, in turn, felt the fragility of her restored strength, the nobility in her blood, and the vulnerability that demanded his constant vigilance. During the fire, Isabella began to speak of her family and lands in greater detail. Dakota listened intently, not with awe, but with genuine interest. She described towering halls, servants, and distant relatives who knew nothing of her plight. She confessed fear for her people, fear that outlaws might seek to exploit her absence. Dakota's response was silent, measured, and protective. He did not offer empty words. He simply ensured her comfort, adjusted her furs, and silently vowed to keep her safe, come what may. His actions spoke louder than words ever could, and Isabella recognized the depth of his loyalty, the rarity of a man whose honor matched his physical might. By the end of the chapter, the perilous escape had solidified their bond. The snow and ice, once instruments of separation and danger, had become witnesses to their growing connection. Isabella's respect had grown into admiration, admiration into trust, and trust into an unspoken affection. Dakota's protective instincts, once purely survival-oriented, had transformed into care that bordered on emotional attachment. The plains, harsh and indifferent, had created an environment where survival was inseparable from human connection. And in this crucible, their hearts had begun to intertwine. As they looked toward the horizon, where distant mountains glimmered with the promise of safety and shelter, there was a shared understanding. The dangers were not over. Human threats persisted. The wilderness remained lethal, and Isabella's hidden nobility made them a target for those who would exploit it. Yet together, they were stronger than any challenge. Each glance, each gesture, each shared breath solidified a partnership born of necessity, but sustained by emerging love, a bond that would be tested in ways neither could yet imagine. The journey that had begun amid snowstorms, massacres, and perilous escapes was finally reaching its end. Dakota and Isabella had navigated frozen plains, jagged ridges, and treacherous rivers, their every step a testament to endurance and resilience. The cold of winter had gradually given way to the first hints of spring. The ice began to crack and trickle into rivulets. The snow receded from exposed earth, and the pale light of dawn carried a warmth that had been absent for months. This slow transformation of the landscape mirrored the evolution of their relationship, from wary strangers to survivors united, and now, towards something deeper and irrevocable. As they approached a small town nestled at the foot of the mountains, Isabella's health and spirit had returned fully. The bruises on her face had faded, her broken arm was healing under Dakota's careful attention, and her steps were no longer hesitant. Yet it was more than physical recovery that marked her change. Her confidence had returned, tempered by the trials she had endured. No longer just a young noblewoman accustomed to comfort and privilege, Isabella had become a survivor in her own right, aware of danger and capable of facing the world beyond her family's lands. The town itself was modest, a cluster of wooden structures with smoke curling from chimneys, livestock stirring in pens, and the faint bustle of people attending to daily life. It was a sanctuary compared to the open, wild plains. Yet as they entered, Isabella's identity became a potential liability. Dakota had long suspected that her fragmented stories hinted at nobility. But here, with eyes curious and judgmental watching, the truth could place them both in danger. It was a delicate moment, requiring both discretion and courage. Dakota guided Isabella through the town with vigilance. His massive frame, once an asset only in the wilderness, now drew attention. Villagers stared, whispers followed them, and some eyes were calculating. Human nature often is dangerous as wild predators. Isabella, understanding the stakes, quietly asserted herself. She spoke of her journey in careful terms, letting only small truths slip to maintain safety. It was a dance of survival, now blending social awareness with their enduring instinct for self-preservation. At the town's inn, they secured a room. It was humble, warm, and clean, a stark contrast to the snow-choked wilderness outside. Dakota tended to the final details of Isabella's recovery, applying salves to lingering bruises, carefully bandaging her arm, and ensuring she rested. Isabella, in turn, observed him closely. The man who had carried her through the storm, fought off wolves and bandits, and protected her at every turn, now moved quietly, attentively, and patiently. His strength was still formidable, but it was tempered by a gentleness that drew her heart in ways she had not anticipated. It was in the quiet of that room that Isabella finally revealed the full truth of her identity. She removed a small, intricately carved medallion from around her neck, a family heirloom, and handed it to Dakota. "This is my family's symbol," she said softly. "I am the daughter of the Lord of Lands to the south. Everything I told you before was only part of the truth. Now you know who I am entirely." Her eyes searched his face for judgment, skepticism, or perhaps awe, but found none. Dakota's response was silent yet eloquent. He held the medallion, turning it over in his massive hands, then looked at her. "Your blood does not change what I have done, nor does it change what I will do," he said, his voice calm, resolute. "You survived because we worked together. Your status does not make you more deserving of life, nor does it make you less human. I protect you because I made a promise, to keep you alive, to bring you through the storm." Isabella felt a rush of emotion. The man who had become her protector, her teacher, her companion, had never wavered in loyalty, regardless of her bloodline or the dangers she carried with it. In him, she saw something rare: honor, strength, and a heart capable of both ferocity and tenderness. In that moment, the bond that had begun as survival necessity transformed into a profound connection, an emotional intimacy born of shared trials, trust, and emerging love. The days that followed involved practicalities as well as emotional growth. Dakota and Isabella navigated the town carefully, avoiding the attention of those who might exploit her identity. She began to speak openly of her intentions to reclaim her rightful place among her family's lands, and he offered guidance on dealing with both the physical and social dangers they might encounter. He recognized that her nobility was not merely a title, but a responsibility, one that demanded courage, wisdom, and diplomacy, qualities Isabella now possessed in greater measure thanks to their shared experiences. Despite the newfound security, the wilderness had changed them both. Isabella moved with confidence, aware of her strength and intelligence. She had learned to read terrain, recognize danger, and act decisively. Dakota, in turn, had softened in ways he had not anticipated. The rigid discipline of survival had made room for emotional vulnerability, for the quiet joy of seeing someone grow, heal, and thrive because of his care. In their shared silence, the bond between them deepened, and unspoken feelings began to surface more boldly. Each glance, each subtle touch, and each act of protection carried weight beyond the practical. They were intimate gestures, proof of trust and affection. A defining moment arrived when word came of a new threat. The same outlaws who had ambushed Isabella's wagon had tracked her, seeking ransom or vengeance. Dakota immediately assessed the situation. Rather than flee, they devised a plan to secure Isabella's safety permanently, using both the knowledge of the land he had gained over years and the understanding of social dynamics she possessed. They orchestrated a route to her family's estates. The journey was no longer merely about survival. It was about reclaiming her life and ensuring justice for those who had sought to destroy it. The arrival at her family's estate was both triumphant and tense. Servants and retainers gasped at the sight of Isabella, battered yet alive, and Dakota, the giant warrior, who had fought through snow, bandits, and wilderness to deliver her safely. Her father, initially wary of the man who had protected his daughter, quickly recognized Dakota's unwavering honor and courage. Respect replaced skepticism. Isabella's survival and the bond she shared with Dakota could not be denied. In the quiet aftermath, away from the scrutiny of family and retainers, Dakota and Isabella acknowledged the emotions that had grown between them. They were no longer merely rescuer and rescued. They were equals, partners forged in fire, snow, and peril. Their connection, born of survival, tempered by loyalty, and deepened by shared danger, blossomed into love. Isabella's nobility was no longer a secret, but a shared truth, and Dakota's strength and honor were recognized not just by her, but by the world around them. The story concludes with a sense of transformation. Isabella, once a vulnerable traveler, had become a capable, resilient woman, aware of her status, responsibilities, and inner strength. Dakota, the giant warrior, had discovered that love and loyalty could grow even amidst the harshest wilderness. That emotional bonds were as vital to survival as physical skill. Together, they faced the horizon, a world still filled with danger, but also possibility. They had survived the storm, conquered the plains, and emerged as partners in life, united, respected, and ready for whatever lay ahead.